One of the major determinants of ranch profitability is how much hay we have to feed. One of the ways to avoid feeding hay is by stockpiling forage.
And since I'm a for-profit rancher, I don't want to feed hay. I like to be able to graze the cattle 365 days a year if the snow will allow me to do that.
Burke Teichert and Jeremy Sweeten are going to share with us today what they're trying to accomplish in developing stockpiled forage.
That I can still be grazing cattle on stockpile when the new green is starting to grow next spring. And I'd like to be able to stay on that stockpile almost until the earliest of that new green is about ready to make seed head.
As well as how to go about selecting stockpiled forages.
The higher the bricks of the forage, the longer it stockpiles, especially in an eastern environment. And that's important to watch. So make some of those decisions based off of a refractometer reading.
All that and more on this episode 450 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined today by Jeremy Sweeten and Burke Teichert, and we are going to talk to them about the how and why of developing stockpiled forage, and we're going to try and get as practical as possible in this conversation about what we're going to be looking to accomplish when we set out to graze for more days in the year and feed less days of the year. So we'll have that conversation with Jeremy and Burke right after this word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Are rising input costs keeping you up at night? At Understanding Ag, they help producers like you save money and build resilience through regenerative agriculture. Their team of experienced farmers and ranchers will show you how to reduce reliance on costly fertilizers, pesticides, and feed by working with nature, not against it. With proven regenerative practices, you can improve soil health, boost water retention, and increase your land's productivity while cutting expenses. From grazing plans to cover cropping to full system redesigns, they tailor solutions to your land and your goals. Let them help you make the transition from input-intensive, conventional to profit-enhancing regenerative agriculture. Visit understandingag.com and take the first step toward a more profitable and sustainable future. Jeremy, Burke, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, always a great time to have a discussion about stockpiling forage, but especially this time of year when we're right at the start of August and looking at how do we make sure that we've got some winter feed ahead of us. And so I guess maybe a place to start out is kind of the why or what is stockpiled forage? What are we talking about when we say that?
To me, stockpiled forage is a bank of forage that you can use until the same plants start to grow again. And I'm more familiar in the West than I am in the East, but in the West, typically, most of our grass growth occurs in about 60 days' time, from about May 15 to July 15. And so you have to ration that through the remainder of the year or feed hay. And since I'm a for-profit rancher, I don't want to feed hay. I like to be able to graze the cattle 365 days a year if the snow will allow me to do that. And if the snow won't allow me to do that, I want to still graze as many days as I can possibly graze without hurting the cattle because of snow depth or the toughness of the snow.
And kind of the metric that you would use as far as hurting the cattle would be impacting the pregnancy rates?
That would be the longest. That would be the long term and most economic consequence would be reduced pregnancy rate. But the things I'm going to look for immediately on a day-by-day basis is, can the cattle eat until they're full? In other words, is there enough graze available for them that they can eat and get filled up, get a full rumen each day? And cattle can work, especially once they're trained to it, they can work through pretty tough circumstances.
And when I talk to John Haskell, I always try to capture a little bonus content after every episode, and just released the 200th piece of that bonus content here earlier this week. And when I talked to John Haskell about the advantages of ranching in the West versus the East, that was what he pointed to, was in the West, we have that special ability to stockpile forage that will be worth eating later into the winter. Does that match, Burke, with your experience?
Well, I think it's worth eating well into the winter, and actually I like to have enough stockpile that I can still be grazing cattle on stockpile when the new green is starting to grow next spring. And I'd like to be able to stay on that stockpile almost until the earliest of that new green is about ready to make seed head. Now, later greening out plants are going to develop the seed head a little later. If you can get that far into it, then the cattle can balance their diets pretty well. They don't get the runs or the squirts. They might for a day or two when the green first starts to come, but they soon learn that they're more comfortable if they mix the dry with the green. And it just works so much better that way.
I'll come to you in a second, Jeremy, but I want to follow up on one more thing that Burke said. What you said that we're training them to eating stockpiled forage, and how much of that is them getting used to and comfortable with the idea, and then how much of that is culling the ones that don't make it?
Most of it is getting them comfortable with the idea. Actually, they want to graze through the summer. They're used to doing that. As you go into winter, they transist pretty good. When snow starts to come, if you don't bring feed to them, most of them will just eat. And little by little, they learn to work through the snow and how to graze through the snow. You know, naturally, the snow can get so deep and so crusted that you can't expect them to do that. But they will learn, and they sort of learn from each other. Younger critters learn from older critters, and they seem to learn. But there has to be some culling too. Some just don't do well, either because they didn't learn how to take care of themselves well enough, didn't learn how to graze through snow well enough, or they just didn't adapt to the quality of the feed that was available. And there will be some culling. I've never found it has to be severe.
And Jeremy, can I'd like to get your perspective on that as well, as somebody who's farther east in a more humid climate, and with more snow probably than many in the West actually as well. What is your perspective on what stockpiled pasture is?
And Clay, I appreciate that question. And it's really been since working with Burke and some other understanding ag consultants that have opened my eyes to stockpiling. And in our case, stockpile is that what looks like way over mature forage in the midsummer and fall where your neighbors drive by and go, "Are you crazy? Why haven't you cut that for hay? Why haven't you grazed that yet?" And so when the neighbors are questioning, that makes me feel like I'm doing things right. But we generally can do an early grazing in the spring. And then about this time of year through early August, then we set that pasture aside for stockpile. And like we talked before you started recording, we're really high rainfall right now. Our stockpile is anywhere from waist high to chest high. Some of it's even head high. It's incredible this year. But what we run into is, we can graze late into the fall, early winter, and snow depth becomes our limiting factor. And then in the spring, almost all that forage is on the ground. And so where Burke gets to turn out into stockpile, we turn out into flat stockpile. And the cattle will still eat that going for green grass, but what we see is the grass comes up through that stockpiled forage in the spring. Some of them have a tendency just to eat the green and not get into the stockpile underneath, but some of them really do, and they'll balance their ration out. So it's interesting, inter-cow variation. Some manure will be loose, some will be perfect, and some will be stacked up. So there's some individual basis, so you still have to look at it from a herd point of view.
And we talked a little bit about the why, right? We're reducing that hay feeding expense. As Burke said, he's a for-profit rancher, so he doesn't want to feed hay. Burke, do you have a a number or an amount of hay fed that kind of seems to be those ranches that are profitable are feeding about this much hay through the winter?
I think the profitable ranchers are 4 months or less. And matter of fact, 4 months is getting to be a pretty borderline situation in Western ranching. Hay is just very expensive, and it's a lot cheaper for the cow to feed herself and you to supplement a little protein when needed and take care of the cow that way. But if you've got to be feeding a long, long time in a cow-calf operation, you probably ought to be looking at stockers or some other class of livestock.
Mm. And would you say that those profitable ranches that are feeding up to that 4 months are still probably only feeding at a supplementary rate? This isn't substitution feeding?
I'm going to say if they're feeding in the dead of winter, and they're probably substitution feeding. I have fed alfalfa hay as a supplement, but I wouldn't call that substitution feeding. It's just that it was the cheaper source of protein supplement.
Right.
I only offer it 3 times a week at the most, maybe only twice, depending on how much I can haul each time I go and how many cattle I've got to supplement. And I'm feeding between 3 and 5 pounds a head a day equivalent. So let's say 7 times 3 is 21. I go 3 times, I'm going to feed 7 pounds each time I go to give them a 3 pound a day equivalent. And so I would still call that a supplement.
Yep.
And not a substitute feeding in any way.
Right. Yep. Very good.
And then when I do have to feed, I kind of make sure I really do have to feed. I feed about what I would feed if hay was the only thing they were getting. I feed them enough that I take good care of them.
But I'd also like to maybe hear at this point talk about some of the other benefits of the stockpiled forage, some of the other reasons why. And when I think about why, I'm thinking about the benefits. What are the good things? Why is this better than something else? So what are some of the other things that would be on that list for you, both of you?
Well, for me, the trampling of the forage, the ungrazed portion, the trampling, getting it on the soil surface to develop cover. Anytime you've got anything photosynthetic happening, it's benefiting the soil microbes. The soil microbiome is getting better. And so I like to have the exposure of the grazing for as much of the year as we possibly can. We make sure that the manure and urine goes back to the same land from which the feed was produced. I think just a lot of good things happen when you can graze stockpiled feed, and that happen for the soil health. Cattle distribution becomes much better, and thus the distribution of manure, urine, trampling, everything just gets better. So you're keeping the soil covered, which is one of the key principles of soil health.
Yep. And when we're out of sync with nature, or when we're trying to concentrate our feeding into one area, the manure and urine become a liability rather than an asset, right?
They sure can. If you've got too much in one place, it can be a liability, and you've lost the advantage of it, the economic advantage of it, by not having it spread more uniformly.
Jeremy, what are you thinking about as far as benefits?
The main benefit I'm thinking about is when you get to the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, using those disruptions to push the system forward. Stockpiling is a great way to continue that disruption throughout the year. And we're really trying to use that stockpile in different parts of the farm or ranch, rather than every year the same field gets stockpiled. Because then, as Burke said, you get that trampling effect, you get the manure and urine across the landscape, you're grazing at a different point in the year. So all those disruptions are driving that soil aggregation deeper. And the other benefit is with that stockpiled pasture, that extended rest period is allowing new species to come in. And I know we've talked about that in other podcasts, but that's the real benefit that I see, plus the cost savings and labor savings.
I think that this is another one of those things where we start to think about being systems thinkers and managing holistically, or however you want to talk about it, that everything is connected, right? And so if you are calving at a time when they're going to be low on available forage, you're going to have to bring it to them. So I've said to people a lot of times, one of the main reasons we calve later is not to escape winter necessarily, not because it's harder on animals and people to calve in the winter, although that's part of it. One of the reasons we calve in the winter is so that the nutrient requirements of the herd is lower when forage availability is lower. And then when they are at their peak demand for needing supplementation or needing nutrients, so too is the production of the landscape at its peak. And so, but on top of that, if we've got stockpiled forage, we don't have calving pastures. Everything is, any pasture on any given year could be a calving pasture because we're going to be grazing while we're calving. At least that, I think, is the ideal, or what I see other people, some of the people that I look up to in this industry doing. Would you guys both agree with that?
Oh, especially, that's an excellent point. If your calving is somewhat in sync with nature, you need to understand that the day a cow calves, her nutrient requirement almost doubles. Not quite. But for her to graze a ration that's double in nutrients, you got to have green grass coming on. If you don't, it's not going to do that. So you'd like nature to provide that rather than you having to haul it to the cow and feed it in form of a supplement or hay or whatever. If Mother Nature can do that for you, and so that's one of the real advantages of doing this. And it does, no question. It's you like you pointed out, there's interconnectedness between all these parts, and I think the difficulty that many ranchers have, they like the sound of things, but they're not thinking multidimensionally, if I might say it that way. They're not systems thinking yet. How do we interconnect all these parts? And if they need to get that mindset and need to try their best to connect all the parts and pieces that are moving at one time, and then it probably makes it easier emotionally and mentally to move into this kind of grazing and the stockpiling aspect and that sort of thing.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, Clay, being the jokester in the room, I guess the other way I would look at this is that the bison didn't have a hay truck showing up to feed them. So why are we doing that?
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. So let's talk a little bit about how. I think I get locked into a paradigm of thinking if I've grazed it once, it'll be better after it's recovered, almost like a second cutting. And so I want to maybe have some of these stockpiled forages be some of the places that I was early in the growing season. But I know, again, some of the people I look up to most in this industry are guys in the West that are more than a year of no cattle on that acre after they've been there once. So I know this is all going to be context dependent, but we don't necessarily have to have grazed those pastures early and have essentially a second cutting standing out there as stockpiled forage. Some of this is going to be untouched before we get there. Would you guys both agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. And since most of my work has been in the West, I basically am an advocate of a recovery period of 1 year plus. And why do I say 1 year plus? Because I don't want to graze the same place at the same time in subsequent years. I'd like it to be 3 or 4 years before I'm back grazing those same paddocks at the same time again. And that does a lot of good things. And you can kind of understand that those plants that wanted to grow when I had the cattle there this time, they're going to get their chance to grow next time and the time after that. And so that becomes really important. And the next thing that figures into this, by the time we move away from the fresh green and it's starting to get earliest, or starting to make seed head, and now I'm starting to build stockpile behind me for the next year. And so I'm later, and where I grazed it this year, say in May, next year maybe I'm grazing it in June or mid-June, and it's a lot more mature next time than it was this time. And the next year it might be July or August before I start grazing there. So you see, I'm just building stockpile behind me as I go, and especially in those paddocks that are grazed in May, June, and July.
Jeremy, what are you thinking there about some of the how? What's your approach there?
The more traditional approach is graze it early and have that more vegetative growth stockpiled. I've said this in the last podcast I did, but it's still relevant here. The higher the bricks of the forage, the longer it stockpiles, especially in an eastern environment. And that's important to watch. So make some of those decisions based off of a refractometer reading. But what I like is, a lot of pasture ground is not the high rent ground. And so that ground can be left to rest longer, and understanding the difference between rest and recovery, which we've talked about in previous episodes, but then letting some of our perennial pastures just set for a year and then using that as stockpile. But we get a lot of vegetative growth up amongst that mature growth. And what I really like is that that's conserving water, that's increasing organic matter, that's driving aggregation deeper, and still providing good feed for the cattle, because you still have to make money off this, right? And, the other benefit I really see is how it keeps the soil temperature down. That surface temperature stays low with all that armor on top of the soil surface, both living and dying, so to speak. That more reproductive growth is turning brown and fading away a little bit, but there's still green leaves growing and intercepting sunlight. We're hitting a lot of those principles, of those 6 principles, well with doing that. And look at the economics of letting that field set, or that farm set, that pasture set, versus feeding that amount of hay. And it's way cheaper as stockpiled feed. So there's a lot of benefits to it. I don't know that there's too many negatives to feeding stockpile like that.
Yeah. Yep. Very good. And so I kind of hear both of you saying that just long stockpile period, is going to be sufficient, that they're going to be able to do well on that, and that you can, let it go longer than maybe has been traditionally thought. Is that accurate?
I'd say for me it is. Jim Garish has written a book, Kick the Hay Habit, and in that he describes how the amount of hay that's fed is very similar in the southern states it is in the northern states. And why? Because it's a habit. The cattle can, in fact, feed themselves, and we just need to let them do it as much as they possibly can. And as Jeremy just said, we didn't haul supplement to the bison, and people raising bison today don't. Now, they do graze a little differently. They have a few grazing advantages to a bovine, but still, why? And it is a habit that we need to kick, and it just relates so tightly and so nicely to profitability and to soil health. We're dealing with both at the same time, and as the soil health improves, your land productivity improves, and so over time your stocking rate can increase.
Yeah. Very good. Earlier, Burke, you said that, you want to have that stockpiled forage for the fall, the winter, and the spring until the new forage is starting to go to seed. Is there more that you would say about that? Or Jeremy, would you say any more about that as far as the win of stockpile forage and grazing stockpile forage?
I work fairly closely with 2 ranches in Wyoming. And we've been on, I can't remember now if we're going into our 4th or our 5th year on one of them. And we have fed maybe a full feeding of hay 1 or 2 days in the whole time that I've been there. Now, at a ranch closer to Sheridan, Wyoming, we've had some pretty good snow in a couple of winters. And one of them, we had to feed more days than typically might have, but we just weren't as prepared for it. But this last winter, we had pretty heavy snow, and we still fed roughly 30 days. And that's to yearlings and coming first calf heifers. Heifers are going to have their first calf. And so they're fed only that very short period of time. And you've got to know you've got hay to feed when you need to feed it, and where it's going to be, and how you're going to deliver it to them. And we've got some irrigated land on that particular ranch. And on that irrigated land, it's basically a 3-cutting area for alfalfa. We try to just graze, and typically do just graze for 1 cutting. The rest of that is pastured. So we're getting the return of the manure and urine during those 2 times that it's pastured or grazed. And then about 1 year and every 3 or 4, we will feed fairly heavily on each of those irrigated fields. And so we get a manure return in addition to what they get just from pasturing. We try to spread that hay real evenly across that irrigated land, because we don't want to have dead spots occur because we put too much there, but fairly evenly, but fairly heavy. And the result has been good for both the hay ground and the livestock.
Yeah, I think that one of the harder things in ranching is when we start feeding to stop feeding if you don't need to. Like, I think we get into these, now it's hay feeding season. It's haying season. It's hay feeding season. It's calving season. It's fall work season. And we think, well, it's hay feeding season now from, December to April or whatever, December to the middle of May after branding, and we turn out, So I think if we have all of these pieces in place and we have that stockpiled, one of the things that it opens up is, well, we have a day or 2 or a week at a time of hay feeding at different times when the weather dictates that we have to do it. But then that doesn't mean now we're feeding them until they get turned out to graze again. They're here while we need them here to keep them in good condition, and then we send them back out to work, right?
Your mindset changes. Once you start doing that, you get to the point that you absolutely hate to feed hay. And you only do it when you know that you need to do it to preserve good conception rate in the cattle and to be humane.
Right.
That you're taking good care of them. But boy, to the extent they can work and do it themselves, people, once they get in this mode, that's just what they drive to. They just get to where they absolutely hate to feed hay. They will do it, but not because they enjoy it or want to. They do it because they think it's time that they have to.
Yeah, Jeremy, anything to add there as far as the win of stockpiled forage and grazing stockpiled forage?
So, and you can refer back to previous podcasts, and I can't get out of this one without saying it. If you don't know your cost of production, then you can't make an informed decision, right? So if you know your cost of production, it's pretty easy to not start the piece of equipment to feed hay or to set it out when you know that the stockpile is so much cheaper, and that opportunity cost is there. But having hay pre-placed, so when you need to feed hay, you still don't have to start equipment. You can refer back to some of the winter stockpiling or bale grazing podcasts that we've had with other consultants from UA. Those are still very valid. So pre-planning, I like to refer to it as hoping for the best and planning for the worst. So we try to have almost enough stockpile so that if we have an open winter where we're at, and, especially like if the lake freezes over and we, Lake Superior freezes over and then we thaw out, we can get back on grass, or stockpile, but also having enough bales pre-placed that if we get our typical 140 plus inches of snow, that we have that hay available. So, it's a balancing act. And like last year we had bales placed for bale grazing left over, which was kind of cool, because that means we were grazing more stockpile.
Let's talk about where. Again, I think this is connected to that idea that I mentioned earlier about that we're not calving in the same pastures every year. We don't have a calving pasture. And so probably our stockpile is going to end up being at different places around the ranch as well. Are there some considerations there, or things that you want to really pay close attention to as far as the consideration of where we're going to be doing the grazing of stockpiled forage?
There are, and occasionally there's a paddock that's just almost impossible if there's very much snow or it's very much cold. It's difficult to get supplement there if we need to supplement them there, and it's difficult to fence them appropriately if the stockpile's there, but you can't graze it very well. So there are issues like that, and then there's the issue of can you get equipment there at all if you need to, and so there are just some areas that are excluded from that, but it's only a few where you maybe wouldn't go to graze no matter what.
Do you have thoughts about what you would do with those areas?
I'll just slot them at a different time. I mean, I'll just essentially figure a way to skip over them now and come back to them later
when it fits their terrain or whatever the limitation is. Yeah. Jeremy, what are some of the things that you're thinking about as far as where is concerned?
It really comes back to that first principle of context. Burke covered some of that, but what I also see is people get sloppy with this and they want to use context as an excuse of, well, we can't do that. That's our context. We can't do that. Don't use context as an excuse of why you can't do something. It becomes convenient to keep doing things the same way. So with that being said, not to step on too many toes there, but I'd like to look at what the soil looks like. Stick a shovel in the ground, look at aggregation, and we can use that stockpile to build aggregation, plus add carbon to the soil surface like Burke referred to before. So with that being in mind, and then with what Burke just talked about some of those paddocks because of snow depth or something, water supply becomes an issue. But the neat thing about winter is they can walk a long ways for water. And it really helps keeps them in better condition if they're walking for water, or you can use snow depending where you're at. So that is a logistical problem you need to work out ahead of time of having frost-free water for grazing stockpile. But I'm with Burke. Don't get yourself pinched by the weather. If a blizzard comes in and dumps 2 feet or 3 feet, can you get access to hay, get equipment in there, or can you get the cattle out? We've had to intentionally save some stockpile for spring only because of getting cattle out, getting pinched by a snowstorm, things like that. So don't make your life a nightmare that all of a sudden there's a blizzard coming in, it's Christmas Eve, and so you're going to spend all Christmas Day hauling cattle out or leading cattle out of there so they don't get pinched. So plan ahead, pay attention, watch the weather.
Are there some particular challenges that we run into more frequently as we're feeding hay than when we're grazing stockpiled forage? And I'm thinking of like pink eye and hoof rot. Are those things more common in herds that are fed for longer periods of time than those that are typically grazed on stockpile?
I don't know that I've seen much difference there. There could be, but it's not been in my personal observation. The only personal observation I'd have about that is that the better your grazing gets, the variety of plants gets bigger and bigger. And as you get the bigger diversity in the number of plants that grow, the animal's ability to self-medicate improves significantly. They can eat feeds, and they sense it after a while that feed stuff that they're eating is actually helping a medical condition. And you will see, and I have observed this, that the incidence of a thing like pink eye begins to drop significantly. When oftentimes we want to say your overripe grasses and the seed head gets in the eyes, and maybe that does irritate, but I don't think it causes pink eye.
Mm-hmm.
It could irritate it and make it seem a little worse, but I don't think it causes it. And if cattle are just good and healthy, it seems like they resist most of the diseases.
Yeah. Yep. No, I agree with that. In my experience, it's been true. I feel like I've seen that in my experience as well. And we're getting rain more consistently now than we have in the other 6 years we've been here. So we're starting to see some of that diversity shine through this year, which was pretty exciting. The other day we were walking in some livestock, and they were some real tall green needle grass in places I'd never seen it, and in amounts I'd never seen for sure. So it's fun. It's fun when it rains, right? So I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the fact that there might be this uh there might be this reality that if we ran only the cows that we could graze through the winter without having to feed for months on end, and then did something else to match the stocking rate to the carrying capacity in the months where we had more forage available than the cows that we can graze through the winter can eat, we would probably be more profitable. Is that true in your experience, or something to look at as an option?
I would say that is true. And if it's terrain limiting or whatever it might be that says, I can really only comfortably carry this many cows, or maybe we stock up for the driest year and say that's about how many pairs we want to carry. Now, in addition to that, we might run stocker cattle, or we might do some custom grazing for a neighbor or whatever else to so that we can get the advantage of using our carrying capacity to its fullest, because stocking rate is one of the key drivers of profit. Now, you don't want to let the stocking rate outrun the carrying capacity, but if you've got the carrying capacity, let's figure out how to use it. And so stocking for your poorest year or your toughest situation with cow-calf pairs, and then adding to that stocker cattle. And the stocker cattle could come from purchase, they could come from a neighbor, they could come from, instead of selling your calves, keep yearlings over. There's a lot of ways to do that, to increase your stocking rate, either from within or from outside.
Jeremy, anything you would like to add there as far as how does the ranch stocking rate change?
We actually decreased numbers of cow-calf pairs and became more profitable because we started feeding less hay. And there's other podcasts that tell that story if you want to go back and listen to those. Knowing your cost of production is so critical for this, so you can make those decisions. And what I find, I made the comment earlier about using context as a crutch. People get married to a certain enterprise and go, we're a cow-calf operation, or we're a stocker operation only. What I see is please don't get married to any of those, and use those other entities within the cattle business, or even grazing sheep or something else, to be profitable. Look at your net profit every time and what fits your context as far as labor force, fence, water supply, things like that, and pulse that through for whatever the market's really determined and what your grass is giving you. So don't get hung up on any one thing.
We talked a little bit about the difference of the ability, and maybe it's not as stark as some people might say, but the difference of the ability to stockpile feed in the West versus the East. Is there a upper limit there as far as life expectancy of stockpiled feed, and what you would think, I need to get this used by such and such a date?
I don't think there is. If it gets too old, the green will still grow in it. And so they will eat what they prefer. And if you can get your stock densities about right, they will tend to trample the rest. And anything you can trample and leave on the soil surface is a benefit to the soil, particularly in our lower rainfall areas, more typically out west. I wouldn't want to see 30-year-old stockpile. I think the range becomes decadent, and there's plenty of evidence that bad things happen when you let that happen.
Right.
Over-resting can be a bad thing. But if we're talking months, a few months, or maybe even a year longer, I don't think that's going to get you in trouble from a soil health standpoint. economically it might, because you kind of need to use your carrying capacity to its fullest advantage to be economically well off.
So I'd like to be as practical as possible here as we kind of point towards wrapping up and talk about how to get started doing this. So let's just say there's somebody out there listening, and they're in that 4 to 6 months of hay feeding right now, and they're willing to make some changes and try to get to the point where they could start to graze stockpiled forage more consistently and more for a larger percentage of every year. How would they start? And one of the things you talked about earlier, Burke, is getting them comfortable, working them up to it. Is it a gradual process? Are we just ripping the Band-Aid off and going all in the first year? How would you think about that?
Well, I think you could do it either way, and I'd say do it the way that seems most comfortable. But first thing you need to do is get an understanding of what you're trying to do, and kind of know what the options are to move forward. But I guess I'm one that once I'm bought into this, I want to do it fairly quickly, but that doesn't have to be done if you're more comfortable doing it slowly. But to me, is your hay purchased from outside, or are you raising the hay yourself? If you're raising the hay yourself, then you can start to graze some of that hay ground and not hay it, and that grazing that land lets you stockpile something else and stretch your grazing season. You might have to reduce stocking rate a little to make that comfortable, but that's where you can start. And every day that the cattle can graze for herself, or the animals can graze for themselves rather than you having to haul it to them, that's a big financial lever. I mean, that changes the cash flow quite a little bit. Now, on the other hand, if you've been purchasing the hay you're feeding, and now you don't want to purchase that hay, you've got to understand you probably have to reduce stocking rate, because that's feed you're not going to have available. Whereas if you've been making your own hay, that gives you more ground to pasture, and you can move from there. I'm not going to say that's a one-for-one trade-off. You'll have to observe and see what happens in your area. But if your grazing management is good, I don't think you're going to sacrifice much in carrying capacity as you switch from grazing this hay ground to, or from haying that hay ground to grazing that hay ground.
Yeah, certainly. I've thought for a while probably a lot of ranches would be better off if they did do something like that, where you graze your hay fields, and then some of those places where you would normally be grazing during the summer, if they've got good water and everything that you can use in the winter, graze some of those in the later months. And it is that easy flip, the switch to flip to get that process started. So Jeremy, what would you say there about getting started?
The very first thing that comes to mind, Clay, this should almost be a separate podcast, in all honesty. But with current market prices, the lowest hanging fruit is call anything to reduce your overall stocking rate so you can have stockpile. Don't make excuses for cattle right now. Get rid of the ones that don't fit what your system is. Or if they have problems, bad udders, bad feet, bad teeth, whatever, bad disposition. This is a great reason to get rid of them. Because what you don't want to do is keep the same number of animals and just increase your rotation on the rest of your pastures while you're setting aside stockpile for fall or spring feed or winter feed, because you're going to cut down on that recovery time and rest time on the rest of your pasture. So it's going to be a detriment. So don't make that mistake. You need to continue to keep longer rotations on the rest of your pasture during the summer while you're building stockpile with that. I would also really, really look, if you're making your own hay, can you be buying hay cheaper, and can you spread out across those hay acres like Burke talked about and get rid of the hay equipment? Right now, I just went through looking at different insurance and going through equipment values. Equipment actually seems to be appreciating right now rather than depreciating. Just like the cows that are overvalued, this is a great time to get rid of those. So if this is a way, a good opportunity, sell the hay equipment and start stockpiling. So it's a hard Band-Aid to rip off, and realize that you're going to have some animals that probably aren't going to breed back because of it, but you still have a group of animals that do. And those are the ones you want to focus on. So that's my take on it.
And the economics, I mean, they seem to be there, right? As far as just the cost of labor, but as I think Dave Pratt said, it's not the cost of the inputs, it's the cost of the inputting. The money that we spend on machinery to be able to feed hay is also one of the major considerations. And so, maybe you have to sell some of the equipment that you're going to use to feed the hay so that you can develop water that's good in the winter into some of those places where you don't currently have winter water. But I think it's probably, depending on the quality of the equipment, the age of the equipment, some of those things, you're still probably going to be able to develop the water and have some money left over in your pocket after the whatever piece of equipment it is you sold that you used to use to make hay. So I think there's opportunities, and the economics seem to be pretty strongly in favor of grazing more days versus feeding more days. I think I've heard Burke talk about that actually very, very explicitly in the five, the five characteristics of good ranch managers, right, Burke?
Yeah, that's for sure. And there's one thing I forgot to mention back when you were asking. Would there be areas that we would just not be at certain times of the year? If you've got something like pine needle abortion, you have to avoid those pastures at a time when it's going to be sensitive to the cattle aborting due to pine needle consumption. And, locals, if you have pines and pine needles, locals can kind of tell you when you need to avoid it, and then just observe closely yourself and make sure what you've been told seems to line up.
Well, very good. I appreciate both of you and your time today. Is there anything else that you want to say regarding stockpiled forage? Either one of you?
I would just say do it. It is such an economic driver. It seriously is. From letting the cow feed herself to your having to feed her. Any day you can change that. From the cow taking care of herself to you having to take care of her makes a huge difference economically.
Yep. Your time is worth something, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Jeremy, anything?
The two things I would add is, if there's anybody else in the neighborhood that's doing it, use them as a mentor and pick their brain on it. And you can walk into this. You don't have to run into it. I mean, I'm like Burke, though. If we're going to make the decision to do it, I'd like to move fairly quickly. But maybe the first year you make your goal that you can cut a month out of hay feeding. And the ultimate goal might be to cut hay feeding out except for emergencies. But start with a month at a time. Set a goalpost to move towards. And then, Burke and I talked before the podcast, observations are so critical. Whether you're building fence in that stockpile pasture and looking at the animals, looking at the forage available, watching their manure, see what wildlife is in that part of the world, what soil aggregation looks like. Take the whole thing in. Don't just rush through it, and use that opportunity to really make informed decisions.
Jeremy, Burke, thanks for your time today.
Our pleasure.
Very good stuff there with Jeremy and Burke. Really appreciate their perspective and just the way that their two perspectives, being one more Eastern, one more Western, actually match up quite a bit and kind of challenge some of maybe our paradigms on how we think about stockpiled forage and some of those things. Very interesting to get both of them and to share kind of the way that they think about it in their own environment. Very excited for the next episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll be talking to Jeb Cullifer. Jeb is way over on the East Coast and just a totally different environment and a totally different context as far as the farm and the family farm and what they've been doing there with growing fruits and vegetables and some of those things. But then also he is really challenging the paradigms of his neighborhood by incorporating livestock into that business. And so excited to talk to him about that and share with you kind of some of his perspectives. So look forward to sharing that with you coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.